So today's guest is Silvana Fumega. Silvana is currently the researcher and policy lead of the Latin America Initiative for Open Data, also known as ILDA or ILDA, where she works to promote data publishing and the ethical use of data. In the past few years, she has focused her work on open government data and freedom of information policies. I was first introduced to Silvana's work in reading Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein, where her work and the work of her team heavily influenced chapter 2. However, about a month ago, I came across one of Silvana's articles about data for inclusion, and I thought that would be a great topic to dive deeper into on this lounge. So without further ado, Silvana, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you for the invitation, especially if it's a holiday there. I mean, like, even better.
Okay, so before diving into the topic of today's lounge, which is data for inclusion, why don't we start by just telling me a bit about the work you do at ILDA?
Yeah, well, first of all, ILDA is an international inclusive organization that tries to contribute to generate and use evidence to think about some of the most relevant problems in Latin America, based especially on the ethical use of data. We were born around 2012 as a research project in collaboration with Avina Foundation and the Development Research Center of Canada, IDRC. And in 2018, we became an international civil association under Uruguayan jurisdiction, but we are a remote team. I'm currently based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We are also having people in Costa Rica, in Mexico, and because we are now leading the Global Data Barometer, there's people all around the world also working with us. In general, we have several lines of work, but I think the one that we are going to focus today is about data for equality and inclusion. And in that sense, I mean, first of all, I mean, I'd like to say why we are working on this line of work and why we think it's important. Because mostly when we speak of data, we refer to how algorithms use it and the standards and legal frameworks that shape its production. But also data is the basis for designing policies, tools that try to solve at least public problems. So in that sense, if we don't use the right categories to understand why we are collecting the data, we won't be collecting the right data. And without it, probably designing policies that offer solutions to diverse group of people is gonna be incredibly difficult. So in that line of work, we have several projects. One of those is the one that you mentioned about regional standardization of feminicide data. There's also, I mean, together with that project, we started a collaboration with the Data Plus Feminism Lab of MIT, where Catherine is working, and Feminist Uruguay. And that project is Data Against Feminicide. And later, if you want, I can share the link with you because we have resources in Spanish and Portuguese, but also in English. So the idea was to translate everything. So we try to reach the larger number of people that we can, that are working, are interested in talking about data on feminicide. Also, we used to work in women and inclusion of women in public contracting. And also we are now supporting new researchers working on different topics. For example, data on LGBTQ people in Central America, data on migration. Also another research is the feminist approach to geospatial data. And as I mentioned, we are currently in charge of the Global Data Barometer. It's pilot edition, so we are just starting to collect the data from more than 100 countries. And in that sense, I mean, one of the things, I mean, besides collecting data on many topics, we also would like to know about some information about marginalized groups that we know are completely different from country to country. So we want to know a little bit more about that. And we also ask a few questions related to gender, for example, regarding land data use and impact. So there are all different projects that have been implemented with different experts and organizations all around the world. But behind all this, the idea is the same. I mean, how we could help to create a more inclusive approach to data and to also processes surrounding data, and of course, algorithm and standards. So the idea is to think about how we can not only include a few, as we are currently doing in our data and in our tools, but also trying to include all of us. So basically, that's a brief summary. I can go into the details of some of the project, but basically, I don't want to keep talking and talking and talking about the project, but if you want, I can go into some of them.
That's perfect. Thank you, Silvana. And for today's lounge, we will stay on the topic of data for inclusion, but if anyone in the audience has any questions about the other fields of research that Silvana and her team are working on, in particular, the data of feminicides, it's such a hard word to say.
And I have an excuse, I'm not an English speaker, but so I can have problems with those words, but you can't.
Yeah, it's a little embarrassing. Yep, you outdid me there.
No, I'm just kidding.
No, if anyone has any questions on those topics, please feel free to ask in the Q&A period. So Silvana, you spoke a little bit about what data or inclusion in data production looks like. So right now, data represents a select few when in reality, it should really select everyone as a whole and be representative of the population upon which decisions are being made and who are going to be affected by those decisions, especially when it comes to policymaking and programming. One area that is spoken about a lot when it comes to data for inclusion is the danger of having binary data categories. So a well-known one is binary sex categories, the dangers of that, but also binary categories such as race, where an individual who might be half Asian and half Black will have to fill out a form and choose between those two identities, whether it be a form in the doctor's office or a form elsewhere. So could you elaborate a little bit on the dangers or consequences rather of having those binary data categories?
Yes, so again, I think the idea behind this all is about trying to include as many people as possible. I mean, and not just to leave some of them outside of our categories and our data just because they don't conform to binary categories, wherever they are. So for example, I mean, and you mentioned that when we are talking about sex disaggregated data, I mean, in general, is the data collected and presented separately on men and women, and it refers to the biological differences between males and females. I mean, again, this is a much needed step. However, when you are looking into it, if a person genetically assigned sex does not align with their gender identity, probably in many cases we are leaving them out of our data. And if we are leaving them out of our data, in many cases, when talking about public problems, we are leaving them out of the solutions. And probably the problems that are affecting them are not part of the general discourse of public discourse, to say in a way. For example, I mean, just to give you a few ideas, in our work on regional standardization of data on femicide, if we are thinking only on binary categories, we are making some population invisible. So if a transgender woman didn't previously access legal change of their ID, it might be difficult, and this depends on the cultural context of the country. Some countries that might be easier than in others, but remember that in many cases we are working in Latin America, so the contexts are particularly different from country to country. So if that crime, I mean, or that person is not included in the categories, probably we can quantify that as a gender-based homicide. So if we are not adding that, probably what we are doing is we are making this person and this victim invisible. And in many cases, I mean, for example, to go to a simpler examples in a way, I mean, just leave outside feminicide, but as you mentioned, the work and the book of Catherine and Laura Klein, that goes into things like daily things. I mean, like an online user account, even an ID, a bank account, a mailing list. We are only having two options in many cases when we are talking about gender is male and female, we are leaving many people outside of many things that we in general get for granted, but it's not. So it's important to start thinking and rethinking the way we collect data, how we store it, how we share it, how we ultimately reuse it. And in that sense, I mean, it's not only the data, but the standards behind that data that shape that production. And in many cases, what we've seen, for example, again, in the work in Latin America in terms of feminicide, is that these particular exercises that might look a bit technical, what they are doing is forcing organizations to think and rethink about these processes. In many cases, they are bringing about silence and localized changes in bureaucracy. So in that sense, it's very important to understand how powerful it is to define or design a standard to produce data or even a framework, because that can really create positive changes within the public sector, but also the people that we are trying to affect with policies, with tech solutions, depending on the thing that we are working on. So in that sense, thinking that the world is divided in just binary categories is very limited. And in many cases, we need to broaden up our approach and trying to think about all the, I don't know, countless possibilities that we have in our society. And in that sense, also thinking that probably our worldview is not the one that is shared with everybody else in our country or in the world. So because I'm just stepping into other questions, but in many cases, we've seen that talking about global things, universal things, and in many cases, they are not. I mean, they belong to the view of some particular groups of a society that in many cases holds a powerful situation or status. So rethinking about that is gonna at least try to see what we are leaving behind and what we can do to make it better. I'm not saying it's gonna be easy, because in a statistical environment, it's pretty difficult to think about outside these categories, especially when we are thinking about gender. But I think we need to make an effort. I mean, there are many ways to do that. And without that effort, I mean, it's going to be, again, it's clearing people. And probably in many cases, it's not the situation in Canada, because I know there are many initiatives to try to include other people outside male and female. But the situation is not the same all around the world. I'm not even thinking about Latin America. I'm thinking about the world in general. I mean, the outlook is not as positive as it might be there. But again, I mean, we need to start somewhere. And I think thinking outside of the box of the world divided in two, it could be gender, it could be race, it could be whatever it is, that could provide some help for these people that we are leaving behind.
Definitely. And I want to hone in on one word that you used a couple times in your response there. You said data is powerful. So I want to narrow in on that topic of power. One of the principles of data feminism highlights that data is a form of power. And sometimes we focus so much on building the technology that we forget to address the new power dynamics that are formed from this data. So a question I have for you is, whose perspectives is the default in society and in our data, and how does power play a role in that?
First of all, I mean, in terms of data and power, I think it's important because in many cases, I mean, from what I was saying before, we don't register, we don't see, and if we don't see it, probably we are not going to act over that. Whatever it is the problem, it's going to be difficult to act on something that we don't realize is a problem, or a population that we don't realize have particular contexts and particular issues. So having data on that, I mean, it's not enough, definitely. I mean, it's not going to solve the problems, but without knowing that, it's going to be difficult to try to think about policies or tech solutions or whatever it is, if you don't have that first diagnosis to put it in a way. And yeah, I mean, I love the book Data Feminism, and I think I quote it many times today and any other event that I have. And in particular, I think this question relates to what Catherine and Lauren have written in their book, to really think closely to what we think is the default view or default perspective. Because in many cases, this has privileges and again, makes some populations invisible. I mean, it could be in data sets, algorithm visualizations, or whatever it is that we are trying to do. If we are talking about the tech or data world, in most cases, and I guess you know the answer, I mean, it's pretty obvious, the default view is in many cases male, white, global north, and that's usually what we call and what we know so far as the default perspective. Gladly, we are now starting to question ourselves and to see that probably that's not a general view, and is the view of the people holding some positions of power in different, it could be industries, or it could be a society as a whole. So in that case, I think, I mean, we need to think about that because that leads to biases and biases in terms of data, and then data to algorithm, and algorithms to decision making, and decision making to the benefits of the thing that we can really get because we belong to a certain demographic, or the things that we are getting because we belong to a certain demographic. So in a way, I think we need to rethink the way we look at the world, and try to rethink about our own biases that we experience in our daily life. It's not just about data. I mean, it's something that we experience every day, even though we might not be aware of that. I mean, the position of privilege is something that we need to rethink all the time. And it could be related to many things. It could be gender, race, age, class, whatever it is. And the problem is that that could result in different types of discrimination. So again, going back to the data, we are discussing nowadays many things about algorithms transparency and so on. But I mean, those algorithms are built over, or they are fed by data. So if we are not looking at the data before the algorithm or together with the algorithm, probably the results are going to have some biases in there. And again, in many cases, it cannot be deleted completely, but just to be aware of the biases is going to make us think about the solutions that we are providing to certain people, or the policies that we are designing. Again, I mean, they are not going to vanish again, because it's part of our daily lives, but be aware of that. It's going to be probably a big difference in the things that we do. This is a more general approach. I mean, it's not only about data or technological results or even policies. It's about our daily lives. And if we take a closer view to how we conduct, or the things that we view as normal, probably are normal for us, but not for the people that you have next to you. Maybe we can see things in a different way.
And on that topic of normalcy, in addition to thinking about our biases and our own assumptions that creep into the data and the algorithms that we make, when we're talking about the default perspective in society, which you highlighted as, men from the global north, often white, the reason that they are the default perspective in society and in our data is because they're the ones who are collecting that data. They're the ones who are writing those algorithms. So it's just another example too of the importance of having more marginalized communities, people with different experiential ways of knowing coming in and being a part of that data collection, data analysis, to hedge against those collective blind spots that people from similar backgrounds have. So it's a great point that you brought up there.
Yeah, and again, in many cases, we are not gonna solve all the problems and include all the voices, but we need to be aware that the more the merrier, to put it in a way, try to include the more we can. And again, when we do that, if we are thinking about, I don't know, like decision policy design, or we are talking about tech solutions design, it doesn't really matter at the end, the type of solution that we are trying to think. But in the process, we need to think about the people we are trying to affect with it, whatever the solution might be, and include them in the conversation. And again, not thinking about, like, for example, asking their opinion at the end when you have the solution there. I say, what do you think about this? I mean, and you have a whole group of people, or diverse group of people asking for opinion. You have to try to find a way to include them by design. I mean, at the beginning, because if not, it's just a consultation, but it's not really including more voices in the design. And again, in many cases, these kind of solutions are even done with the best of intentions. I mean, it's not that somebody's trying to hurting some group in particular, or something like that. That might happen, but it's not often the case. In many cases, when designing policies or tech solutions, if we are not including the people or the voices of the people that you are trying to benefit, or at least not to hurt, in many cases you can do the opposite. For, I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, I'm thinking about some of the examples that I listen to when discussing gender-based violence. There are examples of that, of safe places maps, and that were shared, I mean, broadly, without thinking about the consequences that might bring to not only the potential victims, but also the people that were running those safe places. So, and again, this was done with the best of intention, trying to provide more spaces for more potential victims. But at the same time, you are putting at risk everything, because you were not thinking about the damages that could cause. So if you ask the potential victim, or if you ask the potential beneficiary, or something that you are thinking, probably those things can be avoided, or at least mitigated. And in that sense, I mean, also when we are thinking about participatory processes for data, to design standards, for policies, we need to think about how we include these people. Like, women here probably have experienced it, but are we inviting them at the beginning, or is it last minute add-on? What are the roles? I mean, are they invited to be included, or as a token? And I'm saying this because it happened to me many times. I mean, like that. You are the gender quote in some panels or sessions or whatever. I mean, like that usually happens, sadly. So being aware when you do that, to think about it in the design, at the initial stage of the processes, thinking about it, how you invite these people, who are these people, and also thinking about something that might seem obvious, but it's not. Like, for example, women should not be the only ones talking about gender. People of colors and people from the global south should not be the only ones talking about race, because I mean, they are not the ones in general causing the discrimination and the harm in the first place. So we need all the voices possible when we are thinking about policies, data, standard tech solutions, or any other tool that potentially could harm or benefit a part of the population or the whole population. So in that sense, thinking about who is at the table, what are the roles, and in that sense, I mean, thinking about roles, it is pretty important. For example, I mean, just to give you a brief example, we were doing an analysis a few years ago on a feminist open government approach, also thinking about the inclusion of women or groups of women in open government roundtables. And if you look at the numbers, they look okay. I mean, in many cases, I mean, there were like 4 countries in Latin America, they look okay. But then if you look closer to the roles those women were playing, that makes a difference, because in many cases, the ones that were making the decisions were not the women, or at least not in the same amount of women. And they were assisting somebody else that was making the decisions. And it's even bigger, this gap, if you go outside capital cities, at least for this particular research, that was the case, that probably in capital cities, the equation was closer to being an equal participation. But if you move outside those spaces, the differences start to raise. And again, I mean, the numbers could be okay, but the roles are completely different. So it's not only important to think about the numbers that you have, I don't know, let's say 50% of this and that, but what are these people doing in your process? How are you inviting them to collaborate? And another example I could think about, and please stop me because I can go on and on. So please stop me whenever you want. But just one last brief example is about inclusion of women in public contracting. There were many experiences I'm talking about the Latin America because that's the area we research on. But in some cases, there were many women or businesses led by women included, but they were in a particular area. When we are talking about services, like for example, catering services, clean services, and those kind of things. And I mean, using these people or these women working in those areas, providing services to the state in those areas. But when you go to, for example, technology or those kind of things, the equation is completely different. So again, the numbers maybe in overall, in some cases could be okay, but you also need to look closer and see what these people are doing and how they are providing, in the case that a participatory process, how they are providing their voices, if it's just a token or it's really that they are invited to let everybody know what they think.
Silvana, I'm glad you brought up that topic. Our next guest on the DFN Lounge on August 5th is a researcher named Michael Flood, and the topic of his lounge is why men need feminism and why feminism needs men. So it goes both ways. It takes more than one gender to have gender inequality and more than one gender to work towards justice.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, apart from some spaces when you're talking with big teams or something like that, that is more like a safe space or something like that. I mean, when we're talking about equality, in any case, we need all people. I mean, it seems obvious, but it's not so obvious in many cases. I mean, if, for example, I'm discussing with you gender equality in a panel or a session, okay, we know already what we are talking about. I mean, we need other people to talk about it and to provide solutions and to think with us how we can make it better. I know it's a silly example, but I think it's a clear example about how to include more people, whoever gender they are, if we are talking about gender equality. Because if not, I mean, like we are gonna just talking between each other and we already know what we think about it. So that's not good for trying to find any kind of solution to the problem.
And not a silly example at all. I think a lot of people resonate with that example. So it's a good example to bring up.
Yeah, and again, I mean, like the lack of an equal approach or the feminist approach is not hurting only women. I mean, many men are hurting because of the society we live in. So think maybe we could be the ones that hurt the most for many years, but we are definitely not the only ones. There are many things that we as a society, I'm talking about like a patriarchal society, is expecting from men that they shouldn't. So again, I mean, it's a different balance, but we are definitely not the only ones hurting in this kind of arrangement or this kind of society. So that's the reason that we need everybody's voices if we are thinking about any kind of solution and trying to be equal among each other.
Very well said. And speaking of including everyone's voices, I would now like to invite the audience to participate in this conversation. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to either throw them in the chat or use the raise hand function, and I'll call on people from there.
It's getting dark here. I'm looking at myself, I'm getting darker and darker by the minute.
The struggles of Zoom. It always takes some bravery to be the first person. Okay, well, I do have one more question for you, Silvana, so I'll go ahead and ask that while we give the audience time to think. But do you have any recommendations or frameworks on how to create more inclusive data practices for all the decision makers and data scientists in the audience today? You've highlighted some, high-level theories and concepts, but any actionable steps that we can take now?
I think I'm going to repeat myself in this because I'm thinking that one of the main things that we need to think about before collecting data or, I don't know, designing a standard or thinking about a policy based on data is asking people to participate. So if we are designing any type of solution, asking people to participate, I think is a key element to at least understand what are the things that we are trying to affect and how are we doing that? Because again, we might have what we think is a great solution, but we are not seeing many things that probably are hurting these people that we are trying to provide a benefit. So I think that's essential. And again, thinking about who you have at your table or round table or whatever it is that you have, and thinking how you are including them in the conversation. Probably this is not just about data or technological solutions. I mean, it's more a general idea, but thinking about that is gonna make a big difference. And also thinking about that, probably when we are thinking about data and how we can, I mean, protect the people that are providing data or information to governments or NGOs or academics or whoever it is that we are providing data, because we are asking them, for example, when we are talking about race or gender, that they provide us with more information about who they are or who they define themselves as. So in that case, thinking about that openness or share data or use data is not the opposite of protecting data, that there are many ways to protect data and to protect these people, but also having more information about a general group of people or a population. So openness and privacy, they go hand in hand. They are not opposite one to the other. So in that sense, because in many cases you hear that oh, but like how I'm going to put somebody at risk or I'm hurting their privacy because I'm asking them questions or providing me with data that is personal, is the definition of themselves and so on. Again, you can do that, but still be safe at the same time. I mean, that these people are safe, not you be safe. So there are many ways to anonymize, oh, really difficult word, data. And also, I mean, including that information in your solutions policies or whatever it is that you are trying to achieve. So again, I mean, that's not a good excuse, to put it in a way, not to do it. There are ways to do it, and there are ways to protect these people as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Openness and privacy go hand in hand. That'll get you thinking for sure. It looks like we have 2 questions in the chat here, so I'll go ahead and read the first one out for you. Simran says, in your career, have you seen things change in terms of the conversation around data for inclusion? Are there positive changes you have seen recently that make you hopeful for the future of data equality?
Well, this conversation, I mean, like a few years ago, we were going, I mean, from professional experience, I mean, we were going to a session, a panel, a conference or whatever, and nobody was really thinking about how many men, how many women do you have in this particular topic. That was not even a question. And that we are thinking about that, and we are thinking about how we are portraying certain groups in our data, that we are thinking, what I mean, if we have data, for example, again, as the example on LGBTQ people in Central America, that in many cases, the data that we have are provided by NGOs and not governments. I mean, looking at that, probably a few years ago, we were not even discussing this. And so doing research on that, thinking about the things that we are discussing here, being able to discuss these things as regular things, of course, they are not the solution. We are very far from the solution. But I think also we need to be aware that we are much better than, let's say, 5 to 10 years ago. Completely, I mean, like it's a completely different world. It's not perfect. We are really far from that, but we are at least starting to talking about it. And the same thing with data. I mean, what I was saying before, that if you don't register, you don't see, you don't act on it. Again, if we are not we don't start talking about these kind of issues, probably that would be a problem. But we are doing that. So I'm trying to be positive, and I think we are thinking now in ways and in problems that we were not thinking before. So in a way, again, it's not perfect, but we are slowly getting somewhere.
Important to acknowledge the progress we've made. That's great. Our next question is from Gabriel. Gabriel wants to know, what are the biggest challenges to collecting data in urban versus rural areas, aside from access to technology, and how do you overcome those challenges?
We don't really collect data in the case of our organization, but what we are seeing is also, I mean, apart from the obvious technology gap in many cases, is about different points of view about privacy, about data as a collective, and those kind of things. So again, we are going back to the same thing, that probably not acting as default what we think should be data privacy and should be regulations on protection and so on. That probably our view is the one that we have because we are, well, at least in my case, in a city, in a capital city, with certain amount of people, certain access to technology and other things, but it's not the case in other places. But again, we are not really collecting data. We are doing research over certain topics. So I'm not the one that is going there to collect certain data. Probably the people working there, and in many cases, government officials working in different areas could provide more information on that. But I'm gonna say the obvious. I mean, like, well, at least what I've seen in Latin America, or even in Argentina, that is the place that I'm based. The technology gap is huge, and also the knowledge about the technology or the data, or even the rights that somebody has over data is pretty important. So in many cases, is collecting data with what? Because I mean, I'm seeing that especially when COVID hit, about getting data, health data, in almost like a paper and a pen. So doing that, I mean, okay, it's better than nothing, but trying to operationally, oh my word, well, to make it operable, that's the word? Operative? Well, to make it work.
Like make it apparent?
No. To interoperability, to make it
to make it operational.
Thank you. I couldn't say that word. Operational. Without a type of data and data set, that's almost impossible because it's somebody with a paper and a pen collecting data from somebody getting to a health center or whatever. So, and those are daily examples, not even urban and rural. I'm thinking about just around here. I mean, and we are in the capital city of the country, so it's not even that. So in many cases, that's the obvious one, but also thinking about that in many cases, people don't know about the rights that they have in terms of the data that is collected of them. And yeah, I think those are some basic ones, and the worldview that we have over how data is protected and the rights that we have over those things. But again, I'm sure there are people that knows a lot more about those gaps than me, because they are working on a daily basis on those type of environments.
Well, thank you so much, Silvana. It looks like those are all the questions we have for today. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. I'm feeling very inspired after this conversation.
Despite my problems with some long words that I cannot pronounce or think about them right now.
Hey, me too.
But you are on holiday, so don't worry.
Yeah, it's the holiday brain. That's it for sure. All right, before
Okay.
we wrap up here, if you enjoyed the lounge today, stay tuned in to our LinkedIn page and other social media channels for upcoming events. Notably, we have the DFN lounge that I mentioned earlier with Michael Flood, an internationally recognized researcher on men, masculinities, and violence prevention. In this lounge, we'll be discussing the role of men in achieving gender equality. We're also very excited to be hosting a book club series on what is considered a holy book here at DFN, and Silvana has referred to a lot throughout her lounge today. It is called Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein. The registration link for the lounge and a link to our website where you can sign up for our newsletter and stay up to date with the book club series is now available in the chat, and we hope to see you all there. Thanks again, Silvana, for joining us today.
Thank you all.